Good morning, everyone. I'm Cecilia Rouse, and I'm president of the Brookings Institution and former chair of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. Thank you all for joining us here today. It's especially great to see so many familiar faces and friends. So before we dive into today's discussion of the 2025 Economic Report of the President, I'd like to take a moment to reflect on its history. The first ERP, as we fondly refer to it, was released nearly 80 years ago in 1947. At the time, President Truman described the report as, quote, an opportunity for national self-examination and self-criticism. This report is a challenge, Truman wrote, to the President and Congress to determine the causes of whatever problems we face in our economic life and to find the solutions to those problems. That's a pretty weighty mission, but it's one that has guided the report and, by extension, the Council of Economic Advisors for decades. Now, before we get too lofty, here's a little-known fact. The Economic Report is actually the only thing Congress legally requires the Council of Economic Advisors to do. I'm taking a tad bit of liberty there, but basically that is the charge. That's it. It's the one truly official job, and so we take it pretty seriously. Having worked on 4 of these reports myself, I can attest to the time, effort, and dedication that goes into their creation. And the final product is far more than just an economic overview. It's an opportunity to evaluate where our country stands, celebrate what's working, confront what's not, and lay out a vision for moving forward. This morning, we'll begin with a summary of the 2025 report from Jared Bernstein, the current chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, and my friend and former colleague. After that, a member of Jared's team will walk us through some of the report's key sections. Finally, we'll conclude with a reaction panel to discuss the larger question, what is good governance? Before I hand things over to Jared, however, I want to leave you with one final reflection. Going back to 1947, President Truman made a bold promise about the economic report of the President. Like all government tools, he wrote, its effectiveness will increase year by year as we learn by doing. So no pressure, Jared. But it looks like this year's report has to be the best one yet. With that, the stage is yours.
Thank you for that warm and informative introduction. I didn't know those Truman quotes. Those were great quotes. I'm very grateful to Brookings for the opportunity to present the CEA's 2025 Economic Report of the President, ERP. The timing for this discussion is spot on. I'm waiting to see if it's 9. Yeah, so since it's 9 o'clock, I can talk about the CPI report, but that's not what I meant by the timing is spot on. We're days away from leaving the building, and though, of course, we didn't know the election outcome when we planned and wrote the book, we viewed it as an opportunity to take a good, hard look at a wide swath of economic policy that was debated, legislated, and implemented over the past 4 years of our administration. As you will hear, and as CC and many others here know, the ERP is not a press release. We're not shy about touting policies and actions that have helped to achieve the goals of our administration, but it's also a volume wherein we talk about unfinished business, about necessary course changes, as Greg will talk about in our climate chapter, to hit some of the goals we've set out. It's also a document where we can take the space, as in the international chapter, to explain nuances that have often been misunderstood in DC's binary world. With that in mind, I'd like to use this brief intro to do 2 things. First, over our tenure, we've learned quite a bit about how to wield policy to achieve strong and inclusive growth, and in fact, that's really the subject of this volume. Starting with the macroeconomy, if we as economists can help achieve strong economic growth along with persistently full employment at stable inflation, we set the stage for many important good things to happen. All the CEAers here, and there's a bunch in the room, know that, quote, we do not overinterpret 1 month's data. unless it's irresistible. But it's good to be here on the heels of last week's strong jobs report showing unemployment's low, prime age labor force participation is high, and 256,000 jobs were added. Such conditions amidst easing inflation should be counted on to deliver real wage gains. And that's what we've seen, not for a month, but for over a year and a half on a year-over-year basis, helping to keep consumer spending rising smartly and fueling economic growth. Indeed, as Kathryn Holston will shortly discuss, the economy has outperformed even the most optimistic forecasts over the last few years. Now, this slide from our macro chapter compares real GDP trajectory across the G7 countries, showing that our recession was more shallow and our expansion the strongest in the group. As we saw over our term, persistently tight labor markets disproportionately help the most economically vulnerable. Over our 4 years, the average black unemployment rate, while still too high, was the lowest for any presidential term on record. As it virtually is always the case in tight labor markets, earnings grew most quickly for the bottom half, and I say earnings as opposed to wages because full employment boosts jobs and hours, intensive and extensive supply margins, as well as hourly pay. These dynamics are also good for animal spirits, which in turn boosts business formation and dynamism, and possibly even pro-productivity growth, a view which gets preliminary support from recent productivity data. The idea there is that at full employment, with its ensuing wage pressures, firms that want to maintain their profit margins can do so by stabilizing unit labor costs, which requires discovering new efficiencies. That implies, against the classical model, that they were leaving such gains on the table, but I'm pretty sure that's actually the way it works. That's one simple insight. Another is that full employment just gets us part of the way to our goal of correcting market shortfalls and failures. Inadequate supplies of affordable health care, housing, child care, insufficient labor supply and education, the need to mitigate climate change, which requires us to incentivize investments in key sectors, all of these require policy interventions, some of which our administration was able to implement, others of which were unfinished business. Full employment macro plus correcting market failures and investment deficits is, I hope, a simple, clear way to explain our economic policy agenda. And that's what this year's ERP is all about. In a moment, you'll learn more from Kathryn, Laura, and Greg about what we did to get there in their areas and what more we believe needs to be done. While the framework is simple, the execution is not. Contemporary politics, especially at the federal level, can and does act to block these goals. Political dysfunction, as everyone in this building well knows, is far from costless. One small and frustratingly repeating example, one that CC, Elizabeth, Dave, Amy, and others here will recall, is wasting time preparing for government funding lapses. Then there's challenges that happen along the way. Full employment macro is great, but what if strong demand collides with constrained supply to induce a 40-year inflationary spike? I'll leave it to Kathryn to say more about that. Also, most of the interventions discussed in the ERP require fiscal support. How does that work when the fiscal path is not sustainable? Before I turn things over to a subset of our senior economists, I'd like to discuss one final area where our administration worked to achieve better outcomes for working people and their communities: international trade policy. Anusha Chari, who couldn't be with us today and from whom I learned a lot about this, led a team in writing an important chapter that's particularly relevant for our time. Obviously, both research and policy regarding trade has undergone significant scrutiny in recent years. Many economists, for example, have become more willing to recognize that trade delivers both benefits and costs, and that the latter cannot be written off as merely transitional. Poorly managed trade, by which I mean ignoring the impacts of job displacement on workers in import-competing sectors, of excess global savings and overcapacity dynamics, and their impact on domestic demand, particularly in manufacturing, can have impactful negative consequences both economically and politically. But the challenge, one that I'm very proud of CEA for taking up, is to not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Especially in a period wherein the economy's supply side was so damaged, we believe that maintaining robust trade flows was completely consistent with the Biden-Harris Worker Center agenda. That's Kamala Harris, but I could easily have said Ben Harris for that one. This meant being clear-eyed about China's overcapacity, especially in key areas like investment, like clean energy, electric vehicles, batteries, while resisting reductionist views like the trade deficit is a scorecard and if it gets bigger, you're losing. In fact, it meant looking not just at the current account or the trade balance, but also the other side of the ledger, the financial account. Here's a key paragraph from the chapter designed to summarize what I think of alternatively as the CEA view, or if you prefer a Buddhist slant, the middle way on the path to enlightened trade policy. It is important to recognize that a negative trade balance does not constitute a negative, quote, score for the economy. Indeed, the United States post-pandemic recovery has been uniquely characterized by high levels of business investment, one-third of which has gone to factory construction. As a result, much of America's investment appears to be going to productive ends. Productivity is rising, business formation is increasing, and it's likely that these potentially lasting and transformative advances would not be possible without the supportive role played by international financing. Speaking of FDI, foreign direct investment, we've talked a lot about our investment record, but this chapter shows that the relative strength of our economy and our financial markets has helped to make the United States a premier destination for foreign investment. Some of this capital is supporting investments we've incentivized in infrastructure, clean energy, and semiconductor technology. Notably, incentives created by the IRA, the CHIPS Act, have helped crowd in foreign investments into the United States, often reaching areas of the country that have traditionally faced economic distress. Now, I suspect there are some listeners here, and if not here, then across the street at PIAE, who would argue that may have been the CEA view, but it wasn't the administration's view. That view was much more protectionist. This chapter challenges that critique. Most persuasive is just to look at the trade flows, which remain as robust as ever, though we're importing less from China and more from Mexico and Vietnam and other more geopolitically reliable trading partners. But neither does the chapter ignore trade's downsides. There are two sides to the middle way. Our U.S. Trade Representative has prolifically documented non-market practices that have hurt our tradable sectors and the communities that depend on those jobs. And we've taken consequential actions to protect American workers, producers, and taxpayers from excess capacity plays to capture market share in areas we intend to build out domestically. We've also addressed national security challenges by blocking exports of advanced technologies to those who might use them against us. With that, let me again thank President Rouse, Ben Harris, and the rest of the Brookings team for inviting us here today. As everyone here knows, it takes a village to complete a project like this. And at the risk of leaving out large swaths of junior staffers and interns without whom there'd be no book, let me call out former CEA members Karabo Jackson and Heather Boucher, who were instrumental in reviewing chapters, Amy Gans, our former chief of staff, who carried the book to term, as well she was also carrying young Sidney Gans to term, Asha Pat and Molly Opinski, who were product managers who gracefully combined extreme niceness with dark threats for those considering missing deadlines. And finally, a huge shout out to President Joe Biden, without whom we wouldn't have been here in the first place, nor would we have had this ambitious policy agenda to write about. Thank you, and let me turn this over to Kathryn.
Good morning. I want to thank Brookings for hosting us, Jared for the opportunity to serve at CEA, which has been just fantastic, my amazing co-author on this chapter, Anne Elizabeth McMahon, who's here today, and our outstanding macro juniors, Griffin Young and Tomer Fiddleman. So in January 2021, the economy was still in the grips of the COVID pandemic. The unemployment rate stood at 6.4%, with more than 9 million fewer jobs being held relative to 1 year prior. Over the past 4 years, the U.S. economy has not just rebounded from this crisis with the fastest recovery on record, but we're also in the fourth year of sustained economic expansion. I'm going to focus first on three key facts that describe the macroeconomy over the past 4 years. And the first is that economic growth was robust and surpassed forecasters' expectations. As of the third quarter of 2024, real GDP, consumer spending, and business fixed investment exceeded CBO forecasts made all throughout the pandemic. And even more stark, these measures are actually above the final pre-pandemic CBO forecast, which of course did not assume that we were going to have a sharp pandemic-induced recession. But as we know all too well, inflation reached a 40-year high in 2022, peaking at 7.2% as measured by the PCE price index in June of that year. Although 4.8 percentage points of disinflation followed, this was of course very painful for workers and families. Finally, disinflation occurred without a sharp increase in unemployment. And so as you can see on the left figure here, the path of disinflation was pretty much in line with what forecasts made at the end of 2022 after inflation's peak predicted. But these forecasters generally assumed that it would take a period of elevated unemployment that was sustained for as long as 2 years to bring inflation back to target. And instead, as you can see on the right, the unemployment rate was lower than even the most optimistic blue chip forecasters were predicting at that point. And so this sort of accords with a labor market that has broken multiple records over the past 4 years, as we outline in the chapter. I think there are three key macro questions that also sum up the 4 years. The first is, why did we do so well in terms of growth and the labor market after such a big negative shock? The second is, why did we get a 4-decade high in inflation? And finally, how did this disinflation occur without a sharp increase in unemployment? The chapter really makes the case that these three questions are intertwined, and the answers to each of them come from the unique nature of the pandemic shock. The pandemic reshaped demand and supply, with entire sectors of the economy shutting down abruptly and demand for goods, services, and housing shifting dramatically. The commonly cited analogy of turning the economy off and then back on again was in some ways apt. We saw that after widespread vaccination, the supply shock largely reversed and the economy resurged. But I think what this analogy fails to capture is the persistent supply and demand imbalances that we saw in some sectors owing to pent-up demand, to very tight labor markets, and to longer-lasting shifts in preferences, such as the desire for more housing. The dynamics of consumer spending illustrate the unique nature of this recovery. On the left, you can see that services spending absolutely cratered and remained below pre-pandemic level through mid-2021, while goods spending, including on durable goods, not just increased substantially, but was really highly unusual relative to past recessions. Because services account for 2/3 of U.S. consumption, the drop on the left was much bigger than the increase on the right, leading to excess savings, which were further boosted by fiscal transfers from the American Rescue Plan. And so this delivered strong consumption, not just in 2021, but in subsequent years. What's particularly unusual about the macro constellation that I've described with strong growth and high inflation is that despite the historically strong labor market, this wasn't the typical wage price Phillips curve story. Instead, we argue in the chapter that the source of inflation was predominantly strong demand colliding with an outpacing heavily constrained supply. We know that supply disruptions started early in the pandemic in sectors such as home building, food processing, semiconductors. These were exacerbated by food and energy price shocks following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. As these shocks unwound, we started to see supply and demand come into better balance, and substantial disinflation followed. But I think in light of the persistence of inflation, it's fair to ask whether policymakers took the right trade-offs in responding to the pandemic crisis. And here, it's again critical to really remember where we were in January 2021. And that was with a path of vaccinations and subsequent economic reopening that was still highly uncertain, and a policy imperative to act quickly and to provide social insurance to households, not knowing who would be the hardest hit. While the pandemic shock was unique, I think there are a lot of lessons here for future crises. The chapter highlights one of these lessons with a call for unemployment insurance reform, which we feel is an area of unfinished business. The experience of the past few years has reminded us to look closely at the role of supply in driving inflation, especially when negative supply shocks are paired with strong demand. But I'm going to close by highlighting another conclusion from the chapter, which is that policymakers need to continue to balance inflation risks against what we know will be the labor market pain following a large negative shock. And it would be a mistake to conclude from this experience that robust and decisive action is imprudent. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Greg.
President Biden set a target of an economy with net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. This chapter discusses the economics of achieving this important goal. There are three main takeaways from the chapter. The first is that the United States has made significant progress towards this goal, but there's still more work to be done. Second, a net zero economy doesn't necessarily require zero emissions in every sector because of the importance of carbon removal technologies. So put differently, it can actually be cheaper to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere than it is to remove all carbon emissions from the economy. Third, achieving net zero will require many different policy interventions to address the many different market failures associated with the energy transition. This figure shows the historical path of emissions in the U.S. economy, as well as projections from a recent EPA study about how administration policies have altered the emissions trajectory. It then compares the projected emissions with current policy to the simple exponential trend we would need to be on to reach net zero by 2050. This figure highlights the widely held consensus that administration policies have fundamentally altered the emissions trajectory of the U.S. economy, but not yet put us on the path to net zero. The economics of decarbonization differs significantly by sector. In the chapter, we divide the economy into the electric power sector, residential and commercial buildings, transportation, and industry. This figure is also taken from that EPA report, and it shows the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act across each of these sectors. We see significant reductions in the electric power sector, but not as large reductions in other sectors. This reflects the fact that the IRA is targeted towards the electric power sector, but also the fact that it's much easier to reduce emissions in electric power than it is elsewhere in the economy. This figure shows one potential path that the U.S. economy might take to get to net zero by 2050. Above the horizontal axis, we see emissions from each of these sectors that I mentioned previously. Only the electric power sector gets close to zero emissions. The positive emissions from all the other sectors are offset by this increasing use of carbon removal technologies. The chapter discusses in detail the economics of decarbonization in each of these sectors. Let me just highlight a few important takeaways from the chapter, given my limited time. In the power sector, we've seen big reductions in the cost of wind and solar. The chapter really highlights the need to combine this with complementary technologies like storage and transmission to make these variable sources of renewables effective substitutes for fossil fuels, and ensure that these reduced costs of renewables actually push fossil fuels out of the grid. For the other sectors of the economy, buildings, transportation, and industry, we really think of decarbonization as a two-part process. First, we want to electrify as many different economic activities as possible to take advantage of that low emissions grid. For harder to electrify activities, available options include things like energy efficiency, using cleaner fuels, and carbon capture and storage technologies. Of these, energy efficiency is often overlooked because when people think about a net zero economy, they picture a world where we're not using any fossil fuels. But in a world where net zero really means emissions from some sectors and offsetting carbon removal elsewhere, improvements in energy efficiency can be a low-cost way to reduce emissions and reduce our reliance on potentially more expensive carbon removal technologies. When it comes to carbon removal, this is an area where technological progress is going to be incredibly important. It is both expected and necessary that the cost of these carbon removal technologies will decrease significantly along the path to net zero. This means that there's incredible opportunities for policy to harness the positive externalities that come with research, development, demonstration, and deployment of these technologies. The administration has done a lot to advance this, for example, with the regional direct air capture hubs that harness learning by doing. In addition, carbon removal doesn't necessarily yield a useful economic product that can be sold in the market. So for this reason, without sustained government intervention, there's not necessarily incentives for this important activity to take place. So for this reason, there's an important role for government to play in creating markets and incentives for these activities, for example, through the subsidies for carbon capture and storage that were bolstered in the IRA. And with that, let me turn it over to Laura to talk to us about health insurance.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity to present our chapter. This is collaborative work with Ted Figinski, Zaria Roller, and Asha Pat. And in our chapter, we really focused on key Biden-Harris policies that were intended to expand and strengthen health insurance coverage in the U.S. To set the stage, a primary focus of this administration was to expand access to affordable health insurance coverage. And over the last 4 years, we have seen record high insurance coverage rates in the U.S. As seen in this figure in our chapter, the insurance coverage rate in 2021, the first year of the Biden-Harris administration, increased relative to the years prior, and then proceeded to reach record-breaking levels in 2022 and 2023, with less than 8% of people in the U.S. without health insurance. Our chapter opens with a discussion of the recent empirical evidence about the benefits of health insurance coverage, which include better financial protection, increased access to health care, and better health outcomes among those who gain coverage. We then go on to talk about key administration policies as they relate to the Affordable Care Act marketplace, the Medicaid program, and the Medicare program. The administration took several steps to expand access to health insurance in the ACA marketplace, which was created to provide access to private health insurance for people who do not have employer-sponsored insurance. Policies included expanded federal subsidies to help individuals and families purchase coverage on the marketplace, extended open enrollment periods and the creation of new special enrollment periods, increased funding for advertising and enrollment assistance, and finally, and so those set of policies sort of led to what we saw in terms of tremendous growth in the marketplace over the last 4 years. This figure shows marketplace enrollment during open enrollment periods. In 2024, plan year, 21.4 million people signed up for coverage. The most recent numbers coming in for plan year 2025 indicate that nearly 24 million people have signed up for coverage. This is over 2 times the number of people who were signing up before President Biden took office. The administration also emphasized policies to expand and protect the Medicaid program, which is the nation's health insurance program for low-income individuals. They raised federal matching funds for states to newly adopt ACA Medicaid expansions, which 4 states did over the last 4 years. They provided states with the option to provide 12 months of postpartum coverage for those getting Medicaid pregnancy coverage, and all but 2 states have taken up that option. They required states to provide continuous eligibility for children in Medicaid and CHIP. And there were a number of efforts to minimize coverage declines during the end of Medicaid continuous coverage, which was part of the federal pandemic response. And the data coming in, most recent data through Q2 of 2024, indicates that low levels of uninsurance were maintained during this period of Medicaid unwinding. There are a number of major changes to the Medicare program under the Inflation Reduction Act designed to reduce prescription drug expenditures for beneficiaries and the federal government. This included limiting out-of-pocket spending for insulin, as well as an expansion of the low-income subsidy program in Part D of Medicare, which is financial assistance to ensure that people have access to drugs. Starting this month, annual out-of-pocket prescription drug spending under Part D is capped at $2,000. And then finally, for the first time, Medicare has directly negotiated the prices of high-expenditure prescription drugs, and these negotiated prices for the first 10 drugs will go into effect in 2026. Together, these Medicare-related provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act are expected to reduce the federal deficit by $160 billion over a 10-year period. So to summarize, health insurance coverage is at a record high today in the U.S. Millions of Americans have saved on their premiums through expanded financial assistance from marketplace coverage, and seniors and people with disabilities are saving on prescription drugs under the Medicare program. Future efforts to further expand and strengthen health insurance in the U.S. can build on these administration policies, including extending expanded financial assistance for marketplace coverage, which is set to expire this year without congressional action. In addition, efforts to address rising healthcare costs can build on this important first step of Medicare price negotiations that we saw under the Biden-Harris administration. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi. Hi, everybody. Thank you. Thank you to Brookings. Thank you, Ben Harris, for inviting me, and thank you all for being here today. My name is Fatima Hussein. I'm the Treasury Department reporter for the Associated Press, and I'm joined today by experts at Brookings and to talk about the CEA report and also just to evaluate some of the chapters in the report. I'm joined by Sanjay Patnaik, who will talk about the climate portion, Louise Shiner, who will talk about macro, and Matthew Fielder, who will talk about the healthcare portion, and also Jared Bernstein from the CEA, who we'd like to start with today to talk about just everything having to do with this report, given the last few days of the Biden administration. So let's get into it, as the kids would say. So in the last few days of this administration, can you talk about the economic legacy of the Biden administration, given the IRA, CHIPS Act, infrastructure, especially given the context of good governance? Was this, in your opinion, good governance overall?
Well, thank you, and thanks for convening this panel. And because I really want to hear from them, I want to be very brief here. The first, half hour or whatever of our morning was very much designed to answer that question, which is that the sort of macroeconomy approach, which I described and Kathryn took you through some of the evidence, is that persistently full employment, recognizing that gets you a good part of the way there towards inclusive growth and opportunities for people and communities who are too often left behind with a trickle-down approach. This is what the president calls middle-out, bottom-up growth. That's not just good micro, it's very good macro in ways that I described, in ways in which Kathryn showed in terms of the trajectory against forecasts and CBO predictions as well. But that doesn't get you all of the way there. There are investment shortfalls. Greg showed that. Laura showed that. Whether it's healthcare, climate, there's an education chapter as well that gets into that. So I would say the quick, the summary answer to your question is you want to run, a hot macroeconomy. Obviously, there are inflationary issues that we can talk about, and Laura got into that. Those are very much tied to the pandemic. But you want to run full employment, what I called full employment macro, and I'd be interested in what Louise has to say about that, in tandem with addressing market failures and shortfalls in all the areas we've discussed. And in terms of legacy, look, if you let these seeds grow, and there are questions as to what that will look like in coming weeks and months, our view is that that set of policies, that approach has pretty quick returns in terms of some of the evidence you've seen today, but lasting returns, perhaps even in productivity terms, which I talked about in my conversation, but certainly in investment terms when we talk about standing up domestic production in areas that have been underinvested in.
Okay, and we'll ask you more questions later. I do have one more for you. Just given the importance of AI, especially given the reporting that came out yesterday, why is AI not a part of this report?
Because it was part of the last one. We had a fulsome chapter on AI in the last report, and I think in deference to our staff, I like to try to have different, focus on different topics. I want to say that the chapter in the previous, in the 24 ERP, was very timely. even though AI, I know, is progressing quickly, that chapter still talks about the challenges in both evaluating and understanding and recognizing whether AI will be complementary or substitutable in its impact in the economy and the labor market. But I do think there's one new thing which just came out yesterday, which is also from CEA. It's not in the ERP, but it's a really important chapter with a team led by Ryan Nunn on the human capital requirements of AI and where the U.S. stands in terms of meeting those human capital requirements. So I commend that to folks here.
Thank you. We'll start with Luis. Thank you. Thank you for reading the report. It's really great, very long. Could you talk about just the macro
chapter.
Chapter and some of your initial thoughts, and then I have some follow-up questions.
Okay, terrific, yeah. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to discuss the ERP and to read the ERP. And it was the macro chapter was a really interesting chapter, looking not just at what happened the last year, but sort of the whole, let's look over the pandemic and try to evaluate the macro performance. It does a great job of summarizing the history, and also sort of, there's nothing I'm going to say that isn't mentioned in the chapter, right, of recognizing all the debates. You know, the tone of the chapter suggests that fiscal policy was an important factor behind the economy's good performance. It doesn't break down, oh, it was because of, 30% because of good fiscal or whatever, which of course it doesn't, because we don't really know the answer. But I do think, given where we are, given what's happened, it is actually really, really important for us to continue to figure this out, to try to really understand what happened. So it's clear, there's no question, Kathryn showed, that the economy now is much stronger than anyone expected to be at any time, whether or not it was before the pandemic, at the beginning of the pandemic, even last year. The economy just has continued to outperform, and that's true whether we're looking at GDP, whether we're looking at labor force participation, like almost any metric, not every, but almost any metric. So it's also clear we've outperformed by a lot Europe and Canada in terms of productivity, in terms of GDP growth, and that our inflation was bad, but it wasn't that much worse than theirs, right? So those are all true. And I think, as Kathryn mentioned, we've probably achieved our soft landing. And we achieved that reduction in inflation without much increase in unemployment, which was not what many of the people who were warning about the inflation were cautioning about. So the inflation itself was a lot less costly than what people might have thought. So that's all great news. And the problem is, the bad news, I think, is that people don't think the economy is working well for them, right? That had political consequences that will clearly be something that people will worry about in the future. And, in some sense, it also is an economic consequence, because we don't get to decide people's preferences. And if somehow they feel that the trade-offs that were made weren't the ones they would have liked, then we need to take that into account as economists. So I think the big questions that the ERP touches on is what explains this set of facts. And I think we need to know more about that. So like when I look at it and I want to play devil's advocate to sort of say, well, maybe it wasn't fiscal, or maybe the inflation was fiscal, here's what I think about. Okay. So as Kathryn said, the speed of the recovery was much better than what people had expected. One of the reasons much better than the CBO had forecasted. The CBO had the experience of the last recession and downturns can be really, really bad and take years and years to undo. That didn't happen. And Kathryn said, well, it was different. It was like a snowstorm, kind of. That would, and I think that's really important to remember when we're evaluating the performance, right? It was a different recession. And so the fact that it was different than the Great Recession, you can't just say, oh, it's because we had better fiscal policy, right? I think, obviously, this idea of a snowstorm is that you close the economy down. In a snowstorm, you don't worry that people aren't going to go back to work when it's over. The same thing was like the pandemic was a temporary shutdown. Of course, it was much longer than a snowstorm. And I think everybody would agree that fiscal policy at the beginning to make sure that high unemployment rate didn't push people into poverty, didn't decimate credit ratings, was really important. But I do think that even on its own, even without a lot of fiscal, the economy would have recovered a lot faster than it had. So it's not like a slam dunk for fiscal, the fact that it recovered better.
Can I ask a question then? Based on what you're saying, is it that the administration, in the context of good governance, could have been better at communicating the state of the economy, and what could they have done in a different way?
So when I think about I'm going to jump ahead a little here because it's not really about this so much. But I think the point is what good governance requires is being very aware of this, the current situation. And that's not just good government, it's good economics, it's good research. I mean, it wasn't just an administration. We were all, like, CBO was wrong, like, people were wrong. But sort of recognizing, you know, what you should learn from the past and what you shouldn't learn from the past, and sort of being nimble, which is hard in a political context. It's really hard to be nimble. As Kathryn said at the beginning, when they came in, you know, it wasn't clear what was going to happen. It wasn't clear how quickly the vaccines were going to be rolled out. It wasn't clear, and you have to make decisions, you know, quickly, and you have to negotiate, you know, and you can't just, you know, it's hard to be nimble when you negotiate. But I do think it became clear that the recovery was stronger than people had thought, and that, you know, maybe it would have been nice not to have quite as much fiscal, which I'm getting ahead of myself here. Okay, let me talk a little bit about our performance relative to other countries. So that looks like, well, we did so much better, but again, hard to know. Other countries are very different from us in lots of ways. We actually had a faster rollout of vaccines, first of all, so our quicker recovery could be related to that. We were less affected by the war in Ukraine and the high energy prices. And speaking of AI, in the past few years, we have benefited more from things that had nothing to do with the pandemic, which is that our tech sector is really good at AI, and there's been a lot of growth there, and that has helped our economy probably more than other economies. So it's just, these things are hard to disentangle. It's not at all a criticism of the report that they don't. I'm just saying, as economists, we need to do that so that we can be more confident to say, here's what the fiscal policy did and didn't do. I think there are some lessons that, again, it's a sort of a research thing. The chapter mentions a little bit about at the beginning of the pandemic. Again, here's a case to where we were all kind of wrong. A lot of us thought, oh, Europe has a better model for unemployment insurance because they keep the workers attached to the firms, and especially in a kind of snowstorm analogy, what you want is to still be attached to your firm so that there's no time to take, you know, to find a new job when it's time to go back. And that's part of what PPP was. It was like, oh, let's try to do some European style thing where we keep people attached to their firms. And I think it's too early to know, but I think part of our better economic performance may be because we did not keep people so attached to their firms, and because there was this great reshuffling, I think the chapter calls it, that might have led to, you know, to better performance. Really important for us to know that for the future.
Thank you. I'll have more questions later for you. Sanjay, could you tell me about your initial thoughts about the climate segment of the report and the administration's hope of achieving net zero carbon emissions? Was there anything that you think they should have done in these past 4 years that hadn't been?
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. I want to start off with an acknowledgement, which is oftentimes I think we forget that the climate policy that the Biden administration implemented is really historic. A lot of political leaders in the past have talked about addressing climate change. President Biden followed through, and in a way that no other president has done before, and I think that's really important. I don't think he gets the credit for it that he deserves for this. Then I wouldn't be a good economist if I didn't have a however after that. As an economist, I would have preferred a carbon price instead of like the IRA. Everyone knows the carbon price would be the more effective, more cost-effective, more efficient way to achieve carbon emissions. The carbon price was politically not possible in the US and hasn't been for a long time. So the administration went with the second best, which is using the carrot approach by using tax credits, subsidies, et cetera, to stimulate investments in green energy, clean technology, et cetera. And I think what the IRA and other actions that accompanied the IRA and the executive side did was to build on the strength that the US has as an economy, build on innovation, on our potential to innovate, and to reinforce existing market forces. That's really important. We already saw a shift in the market towards low carbon technologies to some degree, and the IRA really has started to reinforce that. I think some of the issues of the IRA, and going back to your question, what could have been done differently, is that because it's not a carbon price, especially not through a cap and trade program where we can actually set the limit of emissions, it is a bit uncertain of what the emissions reductions will actually look like. And it's a bit early to tell because we have a time frame of about 10 years. They were really good estimations, really good models that tried to model out what kind of emissions reductions we can expect. But these models rely on a lot of different assumptions. And one of the big assumptions that is also part of the chapter is that obviously it really depends a lot on electrification, on electrifying our economy, different industrial sectors, transportation. But that also means we need to build out a lot of infrastructure in order to actually be able to do all this. And one of the issues that we didn't see was the IRA coupled with a really comprehensive permitting reform bill. And so now we have the disconnect, right? We need to build out all that stuff to actually be able to electrify, which is important and which a lot of other countries are already doing in order to decarbonize, but it really takes a long time to do so. When you look at some of the timelines here, we did some work in our center, the median time for like right-of-way is 9 years. That's crazy if you think about having to build out a lot of infrastructure very quickly. And so I think we need to do much more here to leverage the strength of the IRA and to be able to get the potential that it initially showed it could have. I think another thing, we're talking about good governance, that is important, and that we'll probably have some discussions, is the actual cost of the IRA, right? When we looked at the IRA, initially the CBO priced it at around 300 to 400 billion over 10 years. The current estimates say it's about 1 trillion to 1.2 trillion. And one of the reasons was because a lot of the tax credits were uncapped. And so then more people are taking it up, which is a good news for the climate. That's great. On the other hand, it's obviously more costly for the budget and for the federal government. And so I think it's important to acknowledge this and try to plan for this. I get a lot of questions about how durable is the climate policy that President Biden implemented, especially now that we have a Republican trifecta coming in, that obviously I would say on climate is about 180 degrees from the current administration. And I think the news is not all bad, because when we look at like previous cycles, right, like we have had that for almost 20 years now, that on climate, one administration comes in, usually they couldn't do anything legislatively, they do it through executive action, through the agencies. Next administration, Republican comes in and tries to roll back as much as they can. Now we have the IRA at least on the books. We have a lot of the money that already has been dispersed. We have a lot of money from the IRA going to Republican districts. And there are congressmen from Republican districts who already have said, please don't roll it back because this provides money for my constituents. And so I don't expect the full repeal of the IRA. I think there will be some provisions that probably might be rolled back, might be modified. Maybe there might be a cap on certain tax credits. But I think it will be politically hard for the Republicans with the thin majorities they have to fully roll it back. And I think that's good news, because it means a lot of the climate policy might be here to stay. And a final word before I turn back to you. It's also important to keep in mind that in some ways the genie is out of the bottle, right? We have moved away from coal in the United States to natural gas, mostly because it was cheaper. We're not going to go back to coal because we want to, or someone says we have to, if natural gas is cheaper. And the same goes for a lot of the changes that the IRA has induced and has accelerated in the economy. There is many more new technologies out there, electric vehicles, charging stations, et cetera. There are a lot of investments, and I'm really glad that you brought that up earlier when you talked about carbon removal and carbon capture and storage. I think that was a really smart move to include a lot of that in the legislative package and also as part of the report, because in order to get to net zero, we need to do anything we can. And oftentimes might be cheaper to actually take it out of the atmosphere, or at least out of the smokestacks when we produce something, than trying to mitigate it, because industrial processes are very difficult to decarbonize. And so I think a lot of these technological developments, they won't be rolled back, right? The rest of the world is moving ahead fast. The Biden administration aligned us with the rest of the world, with Europe and with many other countries. And a lot of the technology that we see being developed, where the US is really strong because we are strong at innovation. We are strong at developing technology and implementing it. Just look at electric vehicles, right? Tesla was kind of like born here in the United States. And so that will not be rolled back easily. Even if the current administration or the next one that starts next week will try to roll back a lot of the policies, these market forces, I believe, will continue.
Great, thank you. Matthew, I want to give you an opportunity to talk about the healthcare portion of or healthcare chapter of the report, and just generally whether there's anything that the administration in these past 4 years hasn't done or you were surprised wasn't added in this report, and just your overall thoughts.
So a couple of thoughts. I think the first takeaway from the report is that this administration has implemented some pretty consequential policies aimed at expanding insurance coverage. And I think the report and the presentation both did a very nice job of that. I think one specific piece of that I think jumped out at me and I think is worth highlighting is the role that making it easier to navigate the process of enrolling or staying enrolled in the marketplace or in Medicaid played in the administration's playbook for expanding coverage. I think part of that is a reflection of this historical moment. Biden administration was responsible for unwinding this Medicaid continuous coverage requirement, which temporarily paused the process of annually or periodically redetermining people's eligibility for Medicaid. And so the administration was looking at a very large reduction in Medicaid enrollment as that process unfolded. And I think that created a lot of attention and appetite for ways to make those enrollment and re-enrollment processes work better. But I think the other thing is, I think a lot of the Biden administration policymakers, backed, I'll say, by quite a lot of empirical evidence, I think recognized that how these types of administrative processes work or don't work can have a really big effect on whether people are able to access the benefits they're eligible for. And I think that is a lesson that, future policymakers, frankly, across a whole variety of policy domains would be very wise to take to heart. I think in looking at the sort of what the administration has achieved, particularly in the realm of expanding insurance coverage, I think one big question I have sitting here is how durable some of those gains are going to turn out to be. So we know that the enhancements to the premium tax credits that were enacted in the ARP and then extended in the IRA are scheduled to expire at the end of 2025. Many of the enrollment process improvements are administrative in nature, not all of them, but many of them. And then we, of course, have conservative policymakers and policy experts arguing for steps that would sort of go farther than just rolling back these policies in terms of sort of constraining eligibility or funding for major coverage programs. So, I think one takeaway from that is what happens over the next 6 to 12 months, I think is going to have a pretty big effect on what the sort of Biden health insurance legacy looks like. I do also, just as sort of an aside, I think we're going to get a pretty direct test of one sort of political theory, which was that, once a policy like the enhanced premium tax credits was implemented, there would be very strong pressure to extend that policy. I think that political theory played an important role at various points in the priority setting or lack thereof that informed some of the administration's and congressional decisions during the first couple of years of the administration. And I think we're going to get a sense, with what ultimately happens with the enhanced premium tax credits of whether that theory was well-founded or not. And I think there are probably some lessons to be learned there depending on how things play out. In terms of, you asked about things that the administration didn't do. I mean, I think there are, certainly you can look at things that were on the administration's agenda either during the campaign or, during the BBB debate or in subsequent budgets. I think one big piece of that unfinished business is the Medicaid coverage gap. So many people know, there's still 10 states that have not adopted the ACA's Medicaid expansion. In those states, most people below 100% of the poverty line, they're not eligible for Medicaid. They're not eligible for subsidized marketplace coverage, so they have sort of no source of affordable coverage. During BBB and in subsequent budgets, the administration had supported having a federal solution to that problem where the federal government would step in and provide subsidized coverage to this population. That obviously didn't happen, and I think, for a future administration that's interested in expanding insurance coverage, I think this is probably one of the, lowest hanging areas of lowest hanging fruit. I think another, proposal that certainly came up during the campaign, sort of faded after that, was the idea of creating a public option in health insurance that would provide a lower cost alternative to private insurance plans. I think one reality that is not always necessarily most prominent in discussions around public options is that to the extent they offer a lower cost option, it's generally because they pay healthcare providers less than existing private plans do. And I think as a consequence of that, there was maybe not the political appetite to have a big fight with the hospital industry and with physicians in the context of 2021 that I think maybe led to some deprioritization of a public option. But what I would say is that I think, so, that's a debate that sort of remains for the future. And I think the broader question of whether and how we should be trying to reduce the prices that we pay for healthcare services. The IRA obviously did tackle the question of reducing the prices that we pay for prescription drugs, but I think the question of whether and how we should be trying to change prices in the healthcare services space sort of remains for the future.
Great. I have a couple more questions for our panelists, and then we'll turn to the
Also, could
audience.
I react to them?
Go ahead, please.
Oh, thank you. These are great comments, all really interesting and helpful. Let me just say a quick response to each one, and I'll try to be very quick because I know you want to talk to us and maybe get to the. I have the most to say about Louise's comments just because that's the space that I kind of dwell in a lot. And I want to make 3 points. One is that, it's very important what you said. I think you said people don't think the economy is strong. Obviously, I didn't do one interview where this question didn't come up. We'd go out and stand at, we called it WHNL, White House North Lawn, where we'd go and talk to the TVs. And I didn't do one interview when I'd come out and say, great jobs report. Well, why don't people feel it? A bunch of factories being built. Well, why don't people feel it? I think it's important to be very specific on how we ask that question. It's not clear to me that people didn't think the economy was strong. First of all, there were results showing that they kind of felt their local economy looked pretty good. They felt less optimistic about the overall economy. They certainly were very positive about jobs, and that's a big part of the economy. I think what upset people was the price level, and I think it probably helps us to be specific about that. Also, a big issue for us as economists, and I look in my job and in your job too, you don't dismiss how people feel, but neither do you dismiss what they do. And, as they felt bad, they were spending very robustly. So there's this interesting conundrum between I don't think the economy is good, but I also am consuming pretty aggressively. Snowstorm to me is not a great analogy because this was a 100-year pandemic. Snowstorms, we just had one. So I think what that loses, and you actually spoke to this, is the uncertainty of the moment. And Kathryn got into this a little bit. Where we were in 2021, a little bit has kind of gone down the amnesia rabbit hole. There was tremendous uncertainty in the economy. COVID deaths were peaking. The Fed was not confident that we were back on track. Subsequently, it is clear, that the economy was recovering to some degree on its own, but it was certainly not at all clear that it didn't need further fiscal support. And then my only other comment is one that I hope combines, the three of you, which is obviously the theme of the book is good governance, things that we think we did that come under the rubric of good governance to address both macro and micro problems, market failures, investment shortfalls. And, the vaccine rollout, that was a tremendously important example of, perhaps not that sexy, but good, solid governance. When Ron Klain, who was our former chief of staff and oversaw that along with the president, got into office, the vaccine had been developed, but man, it was not out there. And the exponential growth curve of that distribution was a really good example of sort of an unsung part of Bidenomics, which is actually implementing important things. Sandra, you made a point that I thought was very important, and I've made myself many times, which is that the durability of some of the finance work may, in fact, be helped a significant amount by the market forces, the fact that the genie's out of the bottle. I was in the Obama administration, and anything we did on climate, we were faced by tremendous headwinds. In this case, there are private tailwinds pushing, and that's been helpful to us. On the good governance theme, again, as you sort of alluded to, once you take carbon pricing off the table, good governments figure out what's your next best option. I always come back to the fact that Governor Jay Inslee tried 2 or 3 times in the state of Washington to pass a carbon tax and was unable to do so. So if we can't come up with second best options, which I believe we did and which I was happy to hear you endorse, we're stuck. And then landing on Matt's comments, I just wanted to contrast one thing, which is, you make a very good point about how durable these achievements that Laura showed are. If you actually look at the graphs that she had, which were time series, Laura tended to focus on the part, in her 5 minutes, the part of our administration. But if you focus on the prior administration, you see, not so durable. These things can be unwound. We were under Obama, the uninsurance, the polarity will go the way she went. Insurance rates were really climbing pretty sharply. They flattened or fell under Trump. When we came back, they started going back up again. So I think this is an area where durability is vulnerable. And I think what's interesting between the two of the comments here that I just said is one has a kind of market force tailwind behind it. That might be the climate, at least we hope it does. And the other one doesn't. And that's something that I'd love to try to think about solving for.
Okay, does anybody want to respond to?
Yeah, I want to just follow up. It's not really responding. So the plea in the chapter is don't think that you should not use big fiscal again because you're going to get inflation. Let's not overlearn the lessons of this,
right.
This episode, or let's not make the wrong conclusion. And I think that's exactly the worry. I have that worry as well. And so what I'm basically saying is not that, oh, clearly, we shouldn't do it because people feel bad. But politicians will think that's what's going to happen. So what we need to do is really, really dig down and figure out, so that we can say more clearly, well, fiscal did this, and without it, the prices still would have been high, and people would have still hated the high prices, and it's not going to happen the next time, or it will. So you should right size it, whatever. We need to really understand it so that we can make a good case for still doing the fiscal to get us out of the next recession that will be very different, most likely, than this last
So
one.
let me just say one quick thing. We've done a bunch of fiscal stimulus. You, of all people, have written about them eloquently and extremely helpfully. Your fiscal impulses measure is something I click on weekly, so thank you for that. But look, we've done a ton of fiscal interventions, and we've never had an inflation like this one behind them, at least in my lifetime, which is a long lifetime. And then we hit one where we have a pandemic-induced shock and a supply constraint, and along with very strong demand, so both. And so we hit a vertical part of a Phillips curve. It does seem sort of unique.
Yeah, I think actually the fact that we had such big fiscal was also pretty unique. It was a really big package, and that's kind of an interesting question. Why were we able to get that this time and not? And I think that was also related to the fact that it didn't seem like anybody's fault that they were unemployed, right? It was, exogenous. So it was just really different in many ways. And so I just think we can't just be glib about it.
No.
We have to really, really get down and sort of be able to have the evidence to say it's not going to happen again if you expand this much, and here's how to gauge how much.
Okay, I'm sure the audience have a lot of questions about this as well. Moving back to the report in general on healthcare specifically, I think one of the questions we had was, given the glowing report about ACA marketplace access and the increase in access, at the same time out in America, there are many people who in the perceived notion are celebrating the killing of a healthcare CEO, and I'm wondering where is that tension between what we see in this report about the appreciation for what is growing in healthcare access versus what's happening outside where people are celebrating this.
Yeah, I think the first thing is I think one can overstate how widespread some of the more extreme reactions to the United Healthcare killing actually were. I think there was an extent to which that was somewhat of a social media phenomenon, not a mainstream phenomenon. I mean, I think if you do look at people's views of their own healthcare and even their own health insurance, they're surprisingly positive. So I think it's important to put that in context. I think there are a set of questions that are bubbling up, particularly around insurers' utilization management practices. And I think this is a place where there's, frankly, a really difficult set of trade-offs without easy answers, right? We know that we have a system where healthcare providers have incentives to deliver more services, sometimes even if those services are not delivering particularly great value. And so there is a role for health insurers to be putting in place prior authorization or other types of utilization management policies to try to root out those types of lower value services. Now, the flip side of that is those types of policies are very difficult to perfectly target. They probably get some low value care and some high value care, and then they create quite a lot of hassle cost for healthcare providers and for the beneficiary at the end of the day, who doesn't know if, you know, they're 2 days from going into the hospital for a procedure, whether the prior auth for that procedure is actually going to come through in time. So I do think there are some very difficult trade-offs here. I don't frankly think they're new. I think these are trade-offs we've been wrestling with since the HMO backlash in the 90s and trying to strike the right balance. Certainly it is an important policy issue, and one that I think we're going to be continuing to talk about how to get that balance right for decades. Because to be clear, it's not necessarily the case that you would expect the sort of private market to get this balance exactly right. It may be very difficult for patients when they're choosing an insurance plan to evaluate, has my insurer adopted the right utilization management regime? And there may be reasons for insurers to sort of cheat towards being more restrictive because they're trying to avoid the sort of the sicker people who need more healthcare services. And one way to make themselves less attractive to those enrollees is to be more restrictive in these areas. So I think there are all sorts of reasons that this is an important question and worth worrying about. I also don't think it's one that has easy answers, and I don't think it's a new problem, nor do I think it really necessarily takes away from the progress that's been made during this administration in expanding insurance coverage. I think from my perspective, the darker cloud here really is are these policy changes going to last or not?
Sanjay, given that you have a lot of experience in corporate political strategy in the climate context, many corporations are dropping their ESG commitments, perhaps in part due to the incoming administration, but wondering what the sustainability is of some of these commitments, given that corporations are starting to drop them.
So I think it's an interesting question. I think when you look at a lot of the ESG commitments that we've seen in the past, a lot of sustainability commitments, they were mostly for window dressing anyway. The big problem with a lot of the ESG kind of like broader term is it's so fuzzy that it incorporates a lot of different things. And many of these things are even in conflict with each other, right? It's environmental, social, and governance. Take an example. Let's say you have a polluting plant. You own a polluting plant as a company. If you shut that polluting plant down, it's good for the environment, but it's bad for your employees who are losing their job, right? So the governance and social aspect goes down. And so one problem is that ESG has never been really well defined. So a lot of companies just kind of like made it whatever they wanted it to be so that they could signal or try to signal to the outside that they take these factors into consideration. Most companies really didn't do it when you look at the day-to-day business, right? Because when you look at the day-to-day business, the only way to really incorporate those is to incorporate those into your strategy and your strategic decision-making. And those companies, I don't think, would have rolled it back, and you don't see those rolling it back. I think you see those rolling it back that used it as a nice kind of like window shield and saying, look, we are virtuous, we're doing this because it was perceived positively by the public, by the consumers. Now the political winds have shifted a little bit, so they're pulling it back. The companies that really do that sustainably, they will continue to do so, and they tie it directly to their business case and their actually main field of business, because that's also where they make their profits, and I don't think they will turn it back. And the last point I want to make is oftentimes climate is being lumped into ESG. I think that was always a mistake. I think climate should be different and is different, because I often say that when I speak to managers, the way that you should think about climate, and that applies to government to some degree, is first an economic issue, and second a risk issue, right? Because if you're a company and you run a multinational and you're thinking of where to locate your next plant, maybe you don't want to locate it where it's going to be hit by a hurricane every 2 years, right? And it's going to cost you if you do. It's a risk mitigation issue. And I think if you come at it through this lens, you look at it very differently than if you just put it as a broader bucket in the ESG context.
Okay, thanks. And Luis, I have so many questions for you, but I think given that as a reporter looking into the next administration, taxes and tariffs are just going to be, massive. So my question, when I think about the international capital flows chapter, Are tariffs a good tool to steer capital flows?
So I'm going to start off. I'm not an international expert. I don't do tariffs. So I would be giving you the Econ 101, which is I can see the case for tariffs for national security or for resilience, which is kind of a national security thing. We could talk about it in case of, even drugs, sort of what is national security. But, Econ 101 would say we're all better off if we have free trade, and that there's huge benefits to trade. And as Jared mentioned, I mean, the U.S. is a huge beneficiary, even if we have trade deficits of the flows. So I'm not going to say, yeah, tariffs are the way to go, and we should raise all our revenue through tariffs.
Let me speak to that. Also, I don't think I mentioned enough, I didn't tout enough the contributions of Dave Ratner, who was our chief economist while we wrote this book, and Dave's contribution was indelible. But he left me to go back to the Fed, so he broke my heart, and now he's dead to me. No, there he is. So, I still love Dave. The distinction, I mean, I think the distinction you want to make when you ask about tariffs, very important distinction, is sweeping or targeted. Targeted tariffs is something I've always supported, and I think, at least many political economists have done so back, to Adam Smith and moving forward since then. And that's the idea. Literally, when I came up, we were looking at, rubber tires grade 4, which looked like they were being dumped, or some particular chicken part. Like, that's an effective tariff. I think when you have, and by the way, we tried to do some of that in our administration, where we tariffed a number of areas, as I think I mentioned in my talk, where where American taxpayers were making significant investments in standing up domestic production in order, to some extent, to protect from overcapacity plays where excess savers were dumping in our economy. But those were, electric batteries, vehicles, solar. They were specific, maybe 9 or so specific items. I think where you run into problems, whether it's distortionary flows or prices or price effects or currency effects, is when you start talking about a very different type of tariff that's far more sweeping, and that is some of what we've heard from the incoming folks. Now, look, what you hear and what you see it can be very different, and we've already seen, if you're reading the papers, that some of the incoming folks seem to want to be more targeted, and I think that's the right instinct.
Okay. Well, then, since I have you, we've talked about tariffs, but can tax cuts also deliver the kind of sustained growth that we've seen in this report?
Could you speak up a little bit?
Tax cuts.
Tax cuts?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that tax cuts, when we're looking at a fiscal outlook of the type that we are, in my comments, I use the word, the outlook looks unsustainable to me. And if that's what you think, then you want to think a lot more about revenue increases and, to some extent, spending cuts as well. And, our budget had both. Hundreds of billions of spending cuts and trillions of higher taxes, for highly progressive ones. Obviously, we never got that passed. But the critique of our budgets was that you didn't go far enough, but at least we stopped digging. So I think deficit finance tax cuts are quite ill-advised. And then again, if you sort of take the litany of policies, whether it's sweeping tariffs, deportations, tax cuts, and maybe getting sloppy with Fed independence, that many analysts have suggested that that's an inflationary agenda. Now, again, I want to give the incoming team a chance. I don't think they want higher inflation and higher interest rates. In fact, I'm pretty sure they don't. So let's see what happens. I wanted to say one other quick thing about taxes and tax cuts. Sometimes it's talked about that, sometimes it seems like people are saying extending the Trump tax cuts is going to be this positive fiscal jolt. And that's just, wrong. It's the fiscal impulse would be flat because it's current policy. Where you would see, a problem is in the revenue side, because that would be scored as, something north of $4 trillion of over 10 years of a deficit finance tax cut. But in terms of fiscal impulse, it would be flat if they didn't do anything new.
Who on the Trump team are you going to be looking for reliable analysis?
Who did you say?
Who on the Trump team?
Well, I mean, what I think the incoming folks are some of the incoming folks that I've spoken to strike me as serious people who, again, recognize that they're being handed a great economy and don't want to exacerbate things that are getting better in terms of what you heard from things that are going well or getting better that you heard from Kathryn. So you wouldn't, I don't, as I said a second ago, I don't believe these folks are interested in juicing the inflationary impulse, or we already have long rates in particular rising in ways that could be challenging and problematic, both for financing for debt service, but also for mortgage rates. So I think they're going to want to try to, I hope, and I have a piece coming out on this quite soon after I'm back able to flap my gums more publicly. I think and I hope they're going to be building on the progress we've made. When I think about where will I get accurate information, in the new administration, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Our statistical agencies are unmatched for their integrity, their work, their timeliness, and if anybody tries to mess with them, they'll have me to deal with.
Okay, great. Thank you. We're in the last 10 minutes of the presentation, and go ahead, please.
Thank you. I'm a senior at Georgetown University coming from Turkey. Considering the protectionist aspect of IRC, would you recommend other countries to follow the suit and enact similar policies, which may be a spiral down to a protectionist world?
Yeah, I said in my comments that I certainly don't believe that protectionism, you can sit down, defines our trade policy. And in fact, if you just look at the trade flows, both in terms of the current account of the trade balance, but also the financial account, they're as robust as ever. In fact, on the financial account, that's the point of Chapter 7. They're more robust than ever. So I think the idea here is that my basic answer to your question would be that's not a high concern, in the sense that we believe that advanced economies are always and already doing a lot of industrial policy, including us, by the way. It's just that our industrial policy before we got here was far too often through the tax code. Whoever had the most persuasive lobbyists was getting a tax break, and so sectors like finance, for example, were getting all kinds of support, and that looks a lot like industrial policy if you look at it through the right lens. We tried, as we've said, and as I think Sanjay's comments emphasized, to funnel this support into areas where markets left to their own devices were underinvesting, and we see the same thing happening in lots of other advanced economies. I think where you have bigger problems, because I don't want to act like this is all, perfectly risk-free strategy, is, China is obviously, looks to me like their mercantilism is fraught with overproduction and overcapacity. But in terms of us in Europe, I see us doing, pursuing similar paths. Thank you.
In the back.
Wendell Primus, Brookings. Jared, first of all, thanks to you and your colleagues for all the work that you did in your public service. My question is, given that Trump tells many falsehoods about the border, given that our border crossings now are very low, given a fertility rate of 1.7, and the fact when our generation is going to need long-term care services, why didn't you have a chapter on immigration and all of its implications?
Yeah. Well, first of all, one of the first and more inspiring meetings of my life was when I was a little tyke. Larry Michelle and I, Larry's here today, went to meet with Wendell Primus when Wendell used to be putting out the Green Book, and which was similar to the State of Working America in a way, but ours was sort of more labor market oriented. And Wendell kept saying, I was crunching most of the data back then, and Wendell kept saying, it'd be helpful if I could get this, and this, and I kept saying, absolutely, absolutely, and Larry was like, no, like, don't promise, you work for me, not him. So it's a fond memory. I would say that probably the reason for that, it's a fair question. First of all, let me say that again, in the last ERP, we did have a chapter on demography, which got into issues of immigration and was really an excellent chapter written by Mike Caruso that very much stressed out about the fertility rate below 2.1, which is replacement, which 1.7 is below. So that we look carefully at that, and I commend the chapter to you. When you write, if Cece was here, she would totally have my back on this. When you write an ERP chapter, you don't just write it at the CEA and press publish. You have to go through every component in the White House. And the bar for writing a chapter on immigration would have been so high that we probably wouldn't have been sitting here right now. The CEA has been, I think, quite clear. I don't recall whether this shows up in the labor market work, Dave, maybe you do, in the ERP, this one or the last one. But we've been quite clear about the benefits of labor supply, benefits to labor supply, and therefore to the expansion in ways that I know you've written about here of immigration. But at the same time, we're always very careful to talk about legal pathways as what Biden has always supported.
Any more questions? I'll start to ask more questions otherwise. Okay, well then, since Louise, I asked you not a good question on tariffs, I guess
I should know, but
that's okay. I guess on immigration, the report does note the benefits of immigration to labor demand and supply, and the report also notes what that means going forward. Has the increase in foreign-born people in the U.S. been a net positive or net negative to the U.S.?
Oh yeah, I think clearly it's a net positive. So in a couple of ways. So when you just think about some of the statistics on why our GDP is so much higher, part of it is that we've had more people come in than before. And so, it just makes us a stronger country. We are particularly good at attracting, if we would let more people come in, the people who are going to be creating the Teslas and who are going to be going to Silicon Valley and who are going to be innovation. And I think that's one of the U.S.'s great strengths, that it is a place people all want to come to. And so doing more of that. And I think just the statistics show, like even from a government budget perspective, that immigration is a small net positive. One of the things people have talked about is that immigration was also key to keeping inflation from rising too much. And I think that is a little bit more of an open question, because immigrants come in and they supply labor, but they also increase consumption. There's been some studies that say it's kind of a wash, but you might think in some sectors where we're heavily dependent on immigration, like construction, it was a positive. And as Wendell was saying, it's going to be increasingly important, not just at the high end, but for lower skilled labor for caring for an aging population. Most of the people who care for an aging population are immigrants. And so, I think a pro-immigration policy is good for the economy.
Go ahead.
Just jump in on that. I mean, one of the things we've been talking about more generally on this panel is sort of good governance. And I do think one of the key places where governance challenges arise is where there's a disconnect between, I think, what the evidence shows about what a policy intervention does and what the public thinks about what a particular policy intervention does. And it seems like sort of immigration is one of those places where we have that very severe disconnect right now. And for thinking of, for people thinking about how are we going to have good governance and good policy going forward, figuring out how to resolve that disconnect strikes me as a sort of fairly fundamental challenge.
just to build on
Oh,
that.
sorry,
No,
please.
please go ahead.
Well, I just totally agree, and we should have panels, a lot of panels on that question. Probably haven't had enough. Just one point, underscoring Louise's point. A lot of people say, I hear a lot of people say, doing kind of macro analysis of potential forthcoming policies, that deportation might not have much economic impact because it may hurt you on the supply side, but it also alleviate some demand, so that it may not necessarily be, quite the shock that some folks say. I think where that breaks down is exactly where Louise said. If it's focused on particular sectors, if in construction you have, a significant supply shock in a sector that's really important because we need to build affordable housing, that strikes me as particularly damaging.
Sanjay, did you
Sure.
want to?
Just briefly on your tension, right? Like how you can bridge that evidence and what people perceive. I think we see that all over the Western world, and I think the way to do it is to acknowledge that we need to kind of like try to curb undocumented immigration and try to open up more channels of legal immigration. And I think that's the way where you could thread that political needle, because we see that in countries all over Western Europe, it's the same issue. And I think there's where like economics and political reality collide, and you have to find a way to kind of like reconcile those two.
Yeah.
Okay.
good
So
point.
the next panel will be about immigration. Great. Thank you everybody for coming, and if we could have a round of applause for our panel.